Good afternoon, and welcome to the second panel of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Sixth Annual Conference, examining U.S. policy and global competition in the Middle East. I'm Shibli Talhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I also serve on the board, the academic board of the Arab Center. I'm delighted to be with you today to chair this panel titled Energy Diplomacy and Geopolitical Influence in the Middle East. I'm joined by four outstanding experts, and many of you know them and have read them before, who will explore the changing energy and economic relations in the Middle East and the impact of geopolitical power on economic development and on U.S. leverage in the region. They will discuss the shifting outlook toward Asia and Russia, U.S. disengagement, and the economic activities and priorities of regional and global powers and their impact on the future of energy and economic development. Let me introduce the panelists in the order they are speaking. I'm starting off with my friend Tariq Youssef, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program and the director of the Brookings Doha Center. His research has focused on political economy and policy reform and the dynamics of youth inclusion in the Arab world, and his current interests include post-conflict political and economic transitions. Next is Karen Young, another distinguished scholar, a senior fellow and founding director of the program on economics and energy at the Middle East Institute. She regularly teaches courses on international relations and economy of the Middle East, and is widely published and is quoted and appears frequently in the international media. Her research interests include political economy of the Middle East, energy policy, emerging markets, and economic diversification in the Gulf. Next is another outstanding scholar, Basma Momani, who is professor of political science and assistant vice president for research and international affairs in the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo. Her expertise includes Middle East politics and economics, international affairs, international financial institutions, and diversity and populism. She has published extensively and is a regular contributor to national and international media on global security and economic policy issues. And I'm sure you have seen some of her output in recent months. Finally, Camille Lons, a research associate in the Middle East office of the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Her research covers political and security developments in the Gulf region, with a specific focus on Gulf countries' economic and political relations with Asian powers, and the geopolitics of ports, trade routes, and logistics infrastructures in the Gulf and Red Sea. And you'll see that she brings in a very interesting dimension to the conversation. Many thanks to all four of you for being with us today. Before I turn over to our speakers for their remarks, I want to remind the audience to submit questions. You know, we're going to have a 1.5 hour question period from 1 to 1:30, and you can submit those on Zoom in the question and answer feature that I will then read after the speakers and their remarks. Thank you so much. Let me start with Tariq Youssef.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Shibli and everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. We haven't met in person in quite a while.
Yes.
But thank you for the Arab Center for extending this invitation, bringing us together and giving us an opportunity to discuss a set of very important and critical issues. I have to admit at the outset that I've struggled a bit with the outline of this panel. And the title to begin with, thinking about U.S. energy diplomacy in a context of so much dislocation and uncertainty happening elsewhere. And now you bring in the energy, the economy, and societies at large. And thinking about US policy, I think, becomes very challenging, notwithstanding what has been discussed very amply in the previous panel about the uncertainty and immense anxiety in the region vis-a-vis where the US is heading, how the US plans to conduct itself, not only in the region, but vis-a-vis other global powers. So my remarks are going to focus on trying to provide a framework, really, for thinking about energy diplomacy and how this is likely to affect the Middle East. And as the Arab Center rightly suggested, and very appropriately, I should focus initially on perhaps taking stock of where we are in the region, as far as the economies, as far as societies, 2 years into the pandemic, and what the future holds and what we can say about it. And that's precisely what I'm going to start asking the question, or making the point, that in fact, any discussion about the future of the Middle Eastern economy, the economy covers oil, but non-oil sectors, covers labor markets, covers poverty and socioeconomic development. That understanding in 2021 must include some appreciation of what has happened in the last 2 years, the fallout from the pandemic, the economic fallout from the pandemic, or what we might call the pandemic recession, an understanding of what the fallout is, the implications, the effects, and secondly, an assessment of the recovery and how it's likely to take place, if and when, who's likely to benefit, who's likely to lose, and how the region would look. I think once you have that context, then it becomes easier to ask questions about the role of the US, the role of other powers, and how the region will evolve. I think the fallout from the pandemic recession, once we take stock of what has happened, is going to be seen to be massive. I think an immense amount of damage, scarring has taken place across the region. And this has manifested itself in ways that I think, notwithstanding the data problems and the inadequacies, we're beginning to see. I think cohorts of publics in the region, cohorts of youth, have been probably set back a decade in terms of socioeconomic development outcomes. Think of jobs, think of wages, think of livelihoods. I think poverty has taken a big shock, poverty rates, and we've seen emerging spikes across the region, affecting poverty, affecting vulnerability, affecting livelihoods, affecting, quite frankly, segments of the population that in the past had been sort of isolated from the larger economy. We've seen also glaring disparities become very, very clear. This is not just economics and wealth, it's about access to education, access to technology, access to banking. All of this suggests that, in fact, the social peace and the foundations of social peace and stability in the region that we've taken, I think, for granted, and rightly so, for a very long period of time, have been weakened, have been shaken. And governments which have tried to throw everything, especially low-income and middle-income governments, at the pandemic, have essentially come short. Social protection systems have been pushed to the brink. Social assistance was largely absent or confined to segments of the population, and bureaucracies, large, humongous, expansive, have not performed as well as we had expected. All of this, again, is to suggest that the fallout is massive. It should not be taken, it should not be underestimated, and it's going to stay with the region for a while to come. In fact, that also shapes, to some extent, the kind of recovery we should expect over the next couple of years as the world begins to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and associated economic effects. I think the recovery, as the IMF rightly pointed out, is going to be a long one. It's going to be a slow one. It's going to be incomplete, and it's going to be divergent, meaning the Middle East that is likely to emerge economically post-COVID is going to look very different from how it did. Keep in mind that the last decade was characterized by so many observers as being a lost decade, the post-Arab Spring decade, economically and developmentally. Add to it the massive dislocation that had taken place. Some sectors are probably never going to come back. Think of tourism, think of underpinnings of a lot of informal economies that were pushed essentially out of business. They may not recover, or they will take a very long time to recover. Governments have amassed amounts of debt to keep economies running. A lot of this debt is gonna come due on top of the debt they had in fact burdened themselves with and the economies with in the last decade, and that is going to be yet another huge challenge for most governments to manage. We're not just talking here about the poor economies. We're also talking about some countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Think of Bahrain, think of Oman. Everyone in many ways has been really pushed. And so both this reading of the fallout and the nature of the recovery are suggesting already to me that this time is different. Unlike previous recessions, which had taken place over the last 30 years, this is not going to be a recession where you're going to essentially push the button, the world economy recovers, and you ride. And that's partly because of other structural features, changes that are taking place within the international system that I think worth pointing out to. One is, the retreat of globalization. I think there's immense anxiety in many parts of the region about the future of the global economy. Are we in a world of economic nationalism where each country is looking after its own interests? Or are we going to find a new understanding around a global economy that is connected, interdependent, but still protects workers and protects the segments that have sort of lashed back at politicians and governments elsewhere? That uncertainty for a lot of countries that have made a bet on an open, vibrant, and growing international system, I think is a cause for concern, and one that is likely to shape the recovery. Perhaps the one that's most relevant for our panel, and I'll leave it for other panelists to cover, but it's worth noting because of its economic implications, is the energy transition, the uncertainty and the worries about the energy transition. There is a new global agenda and a new global consensus around climate change. With it comes a set of policies that directly fly in the face of interests of many of the crude exporting countries. And they're not just GCC countries. They're countries like Algeria and Iraq. They're also countries like Syria and Yemen and Libya who expect and think that post-conflict reconstruction is going to be driven by oil. Unlike previous recessions, where the recovery of oil markets acted as a very important impulse for recovery across the region. It wasn't just fiscal balances, it was aid, it was remittances, it was trade, it was foreign direct investment. The energy transition presents a fundamental shift and an immense source of uncertainty for most countries in the region, and by extension, the regional recovery. How long are we looking at in terms of the viability of crude? 10, 15, 20, 30 years? That, I think, again, makes the recession this time around and the setback from during the last couple of years different from the past, and ones where the region, on top of a host of other sources of uncertainty, is going to be looking at immense potential dislocation or continued uncertainty on what to do and how to behave. I think this context probably is an entry point for discussing where does geopolitics fit in all of this. So we're not just talking economic uncertainty about the international economic system and global competition and the economic sphere and economic nationalism. There is also global geopolitical competition, and what is happening there and what is likely to happen there. I leave it to, I think the previous panel did a great job of crystallizing these issues, and many of my colleagues will do so again. But from the perspective of those who are thinking about the economy and the energy transition, the US focus on China and Russia is going to present immense challenges to countries in the region. Russia and China have become increasingly aligned with the interests of energy exporting countries in the region by virtue of dependence on their markets or alignment around policies that aim for price stability, that aim for preserving market shares. If this energy transition is accelerates, and if the US intends to confront China and Russia in energy markets, how far will the US go? And will this push countries increasingly towards China and Russia in an alignment around economic interests out of concern for livelihoods, long-term viability? I think that is an important concern. We saw an episode of this last year where, in fact, Saudi Arabia and Russia went head-to-head in a fight over prices and market share. But the US stepped in a very constructive way to try to sort of contain the damage out of concern for its own shale producers. Will the US continue to do this, or will the US realize that the increasing alignment economically around energy interdependence between parts of the Middle East and Russia and China presents energy diplomacy with the challenge of how far do you go? And will that put you in a direct confrontation with your allies in the region, who are not only uncertain about what you're doing, are anxious about your withdrawal, who are fearing probably in other ways pressures to minimize or limit your links and trade with China and Russia. We see this in the areas of telecom, defense, and infrastructure, where US economic diplomacy is pushing countries to limit their exposure. But how far will countries be willing to play along if the US, on the other hand, is also helping to accelerate an energy transition and withdrawing and retreating from the region and creating immense security uncertainty? Last but not least are a set of issues we've inherited from before the COVID pandemic, which was regional rivalries that had flared up and, in fact, had accelerated to a degree where we saw the GCC rift, the blockade of Qatar, and the breakup essentially of the Arab world as we've known it in ways, meaning the level of fragmentation, anxiety, suspicion, competition. What happens to that as we move forward and as the US repositions itself? I worry, Shibli, and I'll try to sort of wrap my comments here. I worry that we're going to be seeing an Arab world where the fragmentation of the last decade is going to further accelerate. It's not only going to be geopolitical fragmentation and security fragmentation, but it's going to be increasingly also economic fragmentation. There's going to be a lot of economic nationalism. There's going to be a go-it-alone attitude. And we've seen glimpses of that recently. We saw it in the rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE around their shares in OPEC. We saw it in Saudi Arabia's very robust assertion of economic national interest vis-a-vis its ally, the UAE, when it comes to the location of companies, the headquartering of companies that operate in the region, its projection of its own economic interests vis-a-vis many other countries. We see the UAE pull away also in other directions. And we've seen countries like Bahrain and Oman facing sort of a lot of isolation and being left to fend for their own economic interests. Even North Africa, where we once assumed had been immune, with the exception of Libya, to sort of the regional upheaval we saw in the last decade and the geopolitical competition, we're seeing glimpses and hints of what is likely to come. Algeria just cut off diplomatic ties with Morocco. And the Algerians are thinking that, no, what happened in Tunisia matters for us, and it's driven by what Egypt and the UAE is doing and what Morocco has done with Israel. I think the fragmentation geopolitically of the last decade is likely to give way to economic fragmentation, or fragmentation of national economic policy. And the bottom line, Shibli, this is going to make it very difficult for the US to be effective in the region. If the mantra of the Biden administration, future administration, is going to be working through alliances, trying to bring countries together, this is going to take a monumental amount of resources, energies, and time, all of which are not available in a region where the US is retreating. And as a result, we've seen the US not be able to affect the course of policy outcomes, and not only in the Gulf or the Maghreb, but in places like Yemen or in places like Libya. An absolute minimalist attitude geopolitically is not necessarily going to be compensated for with a much stronger presence on economic diplomacy or energy diplomacy. And I think that is the sense in which we're looking at a decade of a lot of uncertainty, potential turbulence, and an Arab world that I fear might find itself adrift amongst global shifts and intensifying global competition between the US and other powers. I'll stop here and look forward to the comments of my colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tariq. That was illuminating, and you raised some really important issues, certainly about the Arab fragmentation. We've seen the emergence of the economic competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that might become sort of we might see more of that in the region down the road. With regard to the US, I'm going to ask you later on when we all conclude as perhaps a first question to follow up on the implications, what you think for the US, because one can certainly argue that these warnings really are not taken into account what the US has not gotten from the region over the past. I mean, the US has been intervening, spending trillions of dollars, lots of blood. And one can argue that in the past 20 years, instead of being in a better position, it's in a worse position globally vis-a-vis China. And so are these warnings really, can they be pushed to an analytical clarity more? Because I'm not sure what is the US going to get by being more involved or continuing as it is now. So that's a question that we'd put in perspective, because it's assuming that the US policy and intervention in the Middle East have gotten the US something. I don't think so. I think the US has been a big loser in the past 2 decades. Karen.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, and what a great panel to join among friends and colleagues. It's really good to see you all. I wanted to focus my remarks on thinking through how what we call the energy transition might affect oil and gas producers in the Middle East. And this is absolutely a period of disruption, of change and uncertainty. We're living through some of the most volatile energy price periods in recent history. Natural gas prices are at all-time highs, electricity demand is surging, we have supply outages, and really difficulty in seeing a smooth path for oil prices with so many unknowns in terms of the pandemic recovery, a drying up of capital expenditure and investment into oil and gas discovery and new production, and mostly a policy climate that is hostile to hydrocarbon producers, yet I would say ambivalent on how to replace them. One of the key misunderstandings in US relations with the energy producers of the Middle East has been how we are connected to each other. And the notion of America as a net oil exporter has been, I think, a confusing appendage to a larger movement towards disengagement in the region and a growing justification for restraint or isolation from the challenges of global economic stewardship. In the United States, we do produce oil and gas, but we disagree on where to produce it, federal or private lands. We're not good at transporting or refining it for domestic use. We lack a system of nationwide pipelines, and we're in opposition to neighborhood pipelines like Keystone. We also do a poor job protecting our infrastructure that is most vulnerable to climate change, as we've seen in Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico in hurricane season, and this is likely to become a regular reality. So when our gasoline prices are high, the Biden administration tells Saudi Arabia to increase production, as if their oil wells went directly to the storage tanks under our filling stations, but it doesn't work that way. While we do need less oil to grow, we still need oil and gas. And as scholarship from Ted Erker and Christoph Ruhl has demonstrated, we, meaning mostly wealthier OECD economies, are twice as efficient in our ability to take a barrel of oil to generate $1,000 of GDP than we were in 1970. And this is because of policy innovation in how we regulate pollution, car manufacturers, appliances, and electricity use generally. The developing economies are also getting more efficient, but they will carry the bulk of new oil and gas demand in the coming decades. And this is what is influencing how oil and gas producers, especially in the Middle East, interact with their customers and future markets. More towards the east, more in high population and poor countries, and more for a rising consumer class that will buy plastics from petrochemicals, household appliances, and demand a whole lot more of electricity. So Middle East oil and gas producers know the energy business will continue to grow. So energy business meaning electricity business, especially. But even as demand for oil should plateau by about the 2030. There are a lot of ways to be in this business, including through renewable energy production and solar, and maybe even hydrogen as a transport fuel. But to get there requires capital expenditure and new investment. And this is where the rich world and the developing world have parted ways. Global energy investment, especially in oil and gas capex, fell off a cliff in 2020, going from close to $1 trillion to $500 billion. Clean energy investment in developing countries is a third of what it is in advanced economies and China. So international oil companies are under tremendous pressure to demonstrate their own divestment from fossil fuel exploration and new production. So they're largely out of that business, or finding ways to pair oil production with renewables or sustainable projects. I'll give you an example. There's a new deal signed from Total and the government of Iraq that combines new oil field production with a 1 gigawatt solar plant, with efforts to capture flaring in natural gas, and to build desalination plants. That's a great example of a concern for an IOC into its shareholder interest, but also to partner with a possible area of new oil production. So the steep decline in oil and gas CapEx has created some new inequities among oil and gas producers across MENA. So for national oil companies, some are well positioned to access debt markets and grow. They can expand their businesses along a value chain to sell off assets now in new partnerships. But these are a few, and these are in the Gulf. This is ADNOC and Aramco, and perhaps some privatization in Oman. There's some disagreement among national oil companies in the Gulf about how best to do this, but ultimately they are competing in a more narrow space that requires more attention to customers and attention to partners politically. Note also as an example, the 35-year offshore exploration concession from ADNOC to a consortium of Pakistani oil companies, including government interests. This deal is similar to the Total deal in that we're seeing governments and government entities eager to close deals and willing to be creative in their processes, but these processes are becoming inherently more prone to politics and less open. For example, the tender for the solar power plant in Iraq was a one-bidder contract. And it may be that Gulf national oil companies like Aramco and ADNOC will be well positioned as leaders in new energy sources, especially in solar electricity development and hydrogen for transport, which would ensure their dominance and revenue production for decades to come. For natural gas, this is really different. If we think about where there is energy demand and supply, Europe is energy poor, less interested in oil, and looking for gas. The LNG business is absolutely a transition fuel within the energy transition. It's cleaner to burn, but it's expensive to turn from gas to a liquid, back to gas again, and transport in between. East Med suppliers, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and if they were better positioned, this could be Lebanon, which really misses a window, which is closing. These suppliers must balance between trying to capitalize on their near-term gas resources while investing in regional connectivity and technology. This means pipelines, this means floating terminals, to create a longer-term energy market. But this window is closing too, because as we see in terms of carbon tax and restrictions inside the EU, it will be a short horizon. It's truly a transitional market. There's a ticking clock to avoid stranded assets and more reason for collaboration in delivery projects like pipelines. So Egypt might see more competition to avoid their export points to the Mediterranean. Other states and international oil companies are considering floating gas terminals, undersea pipelines, New investments are forthcoming. This is somewhere where IOCs are very active, and new investments also from national oil companies in the Gulf are happening, notably the UAE investment from Mubadala into the Tamar gas field, which is owned and operated by Israel. Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus appear determined to get their gas to market, yet Qatar and Russia dominate export markets to Asia. So this is really a European game. Also interesting is that the US might become a competitive exporter to the EU of LNG in the future. So within the MENA region, the reality of oil and gas producers has never been more stark. It's also more divided in outlook and opportunity. And the US has never been so disengaged from its own understanding of why the energy transition in MENA should matter to us. How the Middle East is able to deliver energy products within the region will decide which states and their investors dominate for years to come. And the states and national oil companies that achieve dominance in new energy products will dominate emerging markets, Asia and Africa, for the next several generations. And this will be largely outside of US collaboration or investment. So for Europe, managing a transitional energy supply, especially in natural gas, could mean more economic growth or absolute crisis. So for these reasons, MENA matters. What happens in energy markets in the Middle East matters. It matters to US interest, but it also matters, as Tarek mentioned, to how these states have opportunities for growth. And I think we are going to see in the next decade sharper inequities emerging between oil and gas producers within the region, and shorter windows of opportunity to really access new exploration, new agreements, new opportunities to maximize profit from these resources.
You're muted, Shilpi.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that I was muted. I apologize. Besma next.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Arab Center. I really appreciate it. And what a great review we've already gotten from Thought and Karen. You really did get some great experts to talk about this. So just picking up on a few things, and I know Thought talked about this a little bit, but I'll just add on if I may. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. We can't ignore that. I mean, oil is about it's so intimately tied to all things that we do. So we need to talk about variables like the economic growth projections in the global economy, which are so uncertain. I mean, I don't know if others feel the same way, but I feel like the IMF has given us a very rosy picture. And often I find that there's a really clear asterisk of a caveat based on the dispersal of vaccines, and frankly, the dispersal of vaccines isn't happening, right? So it is such a big variable. At the end of the day, if economic growth stalls and continues to be a challenge, that's going to affect us in terms of the transportation of goods, because this is a capitalist world economy where consumption is what really stimulates production and therefore growth. I think even if we get back to sort of pre-pandemic levels of consumption, I don't know how many of you are following supply chains. I've become obsessed with it. I don't know why, but I can't go to a regular store of any kind and not see empty shelves. I don't know if it's a Canadian phenomena. I think it's a global one, but increasingly supply chains are very much broken. I think we're going to see an uptick in production, even domestically, even regionally, to overcome that. This idea that there will be unfettered globalization and we will get goods from China on demand, the just-in-time delivery, all of that, frankly, is in question today. I'm increasingly hearing from companies that they're going to want to resort to more local production or regional production. So for us in Canada, that's often North American production because of NAFTA or NAFTA 2.0. My point being that this idea of global trade of goods, I think, is a part of the scarring. It's a part of a permanent feature. I don't think we're going to go back. Supply chains are thorny and they don't tend to change quickly. People don't want to deal with a new supplier. So the fact that we're seeing slowly a change in companies trying to get input goods more locally, et cetera, I suspect that I think that once that happens and we see that transition take place, and it's already happening, I don't think it's going to go back to China when the pandemic ends. And certainly not with the reality that we constantly hear about oh, this is the beginning of many more pandemics, right? I mean, it's really hard as a business owner to plan those sorts of things. I mean, on consumption, of course, which is a big part of it. And you know, on the industrial side, I talked about that, but I'd even argue on the personal side, right? I mean, individual consumption of oil is certainly not the highest, but car consumption is high. I mean, increasingly, we're hearing the mantra "Build Back Better." I'm sure all of you have sort of seen this slogan, first from the World Economic Forum, and now sort of everybody has one. We have a variety of it here in Canada as well, and some of that is societal. I mean, I think there are some real changes happening, right? So I already can tell you from, again, having in my own personal life as an academic, but also as an administrator at the university, people have gotten used to working from home. The concept of remote work is increasingly being internalized. This is a gender issue too for a lot of women with young kids, which make up a big part of the workforce. Say this works for us. Like, it works for us when the kids are at school. I mean, caveat there, right? But so there's societal changes happening where we're talking about the hybrid office. We're not even talking about going back to the way things were. It will never go back to the way things were. We figured it out, right? I mean, with all due respect, I mean, I used to love coming to DC to all these great events, right? And I'm like, I want to get back to, the Arab Center, Washington's events. I want to go back for Brookings cookies. I mean, I loved going to those things. Do I see myself like I did before, getting on a plane to go to a meeting in Washington the same way as before when we've got Zoom, it's click, click, click? I don't know, right? So, I mean, this is the thing that I think we need to start recognizing. There are just some things that are not going to go back to quote unquote normal. I'm even seeing, I mean, my sister's a real estate agent. So if this was a local, I'd plug her, but there's no point. She's finding lots of clients who are wanting to move outside the city. I mean, it's become now an option, right? So the big thing is not even suburbs. I'm talking rural areas, countryside. People are like, oh, why should I have to live in Washington when I can, move, not even just Alexandria or Gaithersburg and all these, but, even farther away. And so that is also going to change our consumption. So my point is, I think there are some real permanent structural features in the way we operate. And lastly, I'll add, and I see this obviously in my kids and certainly in my students, the absolute commitment to the environment in a way that our generation just, I'm not saying we were terrible. Well, maybe we were, sorry, I should take that back. We were terrible to the environment. But my point being is that they really measure their footprints, if you will. And so there is some attitudinal changes towards indeed getting on a plane. The fact that I once went to China for 24 hours and came back, that would make any student in my classroom absolutely appalled, right? So this is the kind of, I think, behavioral changes, deep structural changes, societal changes that I think we're going to have to really start to think about. So this is attitudinal changes. So I don't think we're going to go back. Now, what does this mean for diplomacy? I love this quote. I actually use it in my classroom because it really stands out to me. Lawrence Korb, which I'm sure many of you know and have seen, he was also at one point the Assistant Secretary of Defense, once said at the time of the 1991 invasion of, or the 1991 war in Iraq and Kuwait, he said, if Kuwait grew carrots, we wouldn't give a damn. I mean, I love that quote. It's fantastic. Because it really gets to the point. I mean, so much of the Middle East has been really wrapped around oil, right? And so this is a broader question. And in some way, I would say, as part of the diplomacy, we've obviously heard for such a long time, there's an effort to pivot to Asia, pivot to something other than the Middle East. I mean, there's certainly enough fatigue, the forever wars. You can't ignore and thank you, Shibli, for the amazing polling that you do on so many of these issues. I watch them and look for them very much in my own work and thinking. So my point here is that I think that there are, again, other challenges happening where even Americans are looking at the Middle East differently. You see that certainly in the progressive part of the Democratic Party and even the Republicans, right? I mean, that sort of Reagan's Republicans aren't there anymore. They're more the Trumpians, and they're very much don't want to, again, they're not willing to go to war to keep the price of oil at the gas pumps low anymore. And so I think there are many things going on that make me It's actually, and I think Karen did such an amazing job of talking about how the oil economy works from an industry level, but it suggests to say that, again, for Arab countries, their relative importance to the United States is going to decrease. I mean, take all these structural features, and I'm not certainly one that thinks that everything must be seen through the prism of oil when it comes to the Middle East. That's absolutely absurd, but it is a factor, and it's a really big factor. We know that historically. I don't think any student of Middle East politics could ignore that, big issue here. Certainly, I mean, I'm not taking away from other arguments of counterterrorism and other concerns that the Americans have, but this is really fundamental. And so I can't see the Saudi American relationship, which of course is enormously under flux today for a variety of reasons, from the issue of 9/11 to certainly even MBS and Khashoggi. There's so much going on there, but will it ever, I'm being honestly imaginative here, will it ever be the same? Will it ever be something akin to the 1940s, 50s, or 60s? I don't think so. And I think that's, even despite the very warm ties that we saw with the Trump administration, I think there is something, again, deeper here where the Middle East is not going to be relevant in the same way. Then I'm going to go on to the question of renewables, because this is really important part of it. We can't ignore the reality that renewables are getting better. They are getting cheaper. First of all, Karen is absolutely right. There is no switch today to turn from oil and gas to renewables. It doesn't exist. There's just not enough of it. And certainly the price point is still very high. But the regulatory pressure that's being put on companies, particularly in the West, is enormous to do so. Increasingly, I think investment in renewables, some of the great applications that are happening, that doesn't get as much, I think, sort of attention, but perhaps in my role as an administrator at the university, I come from a STEM-based university where, conversations about blockchain and AI and all these great advancements in the Internet of Things and, clean energy, the technological innovations that are happening on that is absolutely amazing. So I think we're also going to see a very rapid advancement in renewables. And that means prices will go down because it really is a supply demand issue. And overall, it has been relatively expensive, but the prices are coming down in a way that is pretty exponential. And I think that's really going to even further put pressure. Again, back to the regulatory, we're already seeing, I believe California has, we similarly have done the same in parts of Canada, where already there are mandates on provincial and state level governments to ensure that there is a full acceptance of hybrid cars at some point, or electric vehicles, including the infrastructure development. I mean, the whole Biden, clean energy program includes enormous investments in thinking about electric cars and ensuring that we have the infrastructure to do that, because again, the biggest concern in that market is often distance, right? It's about, am I going to be stranded in the middle of where with nowhere to recharge? Well, that is I think something that is going to be on the agenda of all governments today, is really investing in the infrastructure, which, to add a third point, is a good investment of a government stimulus, right? I mean, if you think about the 1930s coming out of World War II, so I should say 1940s and 50s. I mean, making the highway system and the bridge system, fantastic, was all a part of the advancements of the car. Today, it will be, I think, the investment in these electric vehicle charging stations and the rest of it that is going to as well shift us towards more renewable energy and uses like electricity in our travel. So that's a little bit of a few thoughts, and hopefully added some more flavor and additional perspectives to the great comments I've already heard. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Besma, and thank you, Karen, because I said thank you when I was muted to you, Karen. So both were outstanding presentations, as I would have expected. Besma, I want to also draw on, particularly after when I asked Tarek on this question about sort of the focal point of the US, particularly in its policy in the Middle East. Of course, this is an energy panel, so we're focused on energy. And you're right, absolutely right, that energy and oil have been a huge part of how America defined its policy broadly in the region. Can't understand it without that. But to be honest, in the past few years, it hasn't been energy that is driving the force. And we have not mentioned the word Israel, because obviously this is not about Israel, it's about energy. But keep in mind that even what looked like an energy commitment or energy-driven policy, such as the Trump administration policy toward the Arab Gulf states or Iran, it was much more a function of the Trump's support for Israel than it was driven by energy. Let's keep that in mind when we look at the big picture, not to get entangled just with this one issue, which admittedly is extremely important and certainly in historical perspective had been a dominant factor. I turn to Camille.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really enjoying this discussion. So I've been asked to talk about the Red Sea and how that fits into the picture. I found that quite challenging because when it comes to energy and energy diplomacy, the Red Sea is ironically both central to issues related to energy security. Its geopolitics have been shaped by these issues throughout. And at the same time, it's a region that is often perceived a bit at the margins of the geopolitical focus. It's often perceived more as a transit region or a border region that falls between other more important subregions like the Gulf, like the Western Indian Ocean, like the Mediterranean. And in itself, it's remained quite underexploited on the energy side, mainly because of its topography, because it's deeper, it's more expensive, it's more complicated to exploit. You have here and there a couple of deals and opportunities, but it remains quite marginal. And even for the countries that are bordering the Red Sea, the Sudan, for example, has been a big oil producer for a long time, and for example, China's increasing presence in the region has been mainly shaped by or driven by this need to secure access to energy supplies, and they have invested quite massively in the country on its infrastructures for this reason. But this has been curbed quite importantly since 10 years ago, since the partition of South Sudan, where most of the resources were lying. And same for the Saudi side. On the Saudi side as well, most of the energy, the center is on the Gulf side of the country. Even if we see a sort of not shift but growing Saudi emphasis on its energy facilities on its Red Sea coast, where they try to bypass the Strait of Hormuz and have more of its oil that is being shipped through its Red Sea facilities. The bulk of it remains on the Gulf side still. And so the importance of the Red Sea has been more revolving around its role as an energy corridor. And just to remind numbers, it sees almost 10% of total seaborne traded petroleum and LNG. And even with the evolutions of global energy markets, it remains a key waterway. So for example, the fact that a growing share of Gulf energy exports are being made towards Asia means that there is less northbound traffic through the Suez Canal, for example. But the southbound traffic is growing, coming from the US and Russian crude oil and petroleum products that are being exported to Asia through the Suez Canal. So it's a route that remains very relevant. And also, for example, we talk a lot about the Suez Canal, but there were also a few interesting developments, for example, on the Trans-Israeli pipeline that connects Ashkelon on the Mediterranean and Eilat on the Red Sea. And so as we talk about energy diplomacy in that region, it will be interesting to see also how the rapprochement between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors could open the door to new cooperation on these issues. So the problem is that a lot of the Red Sea geopolitical relevance has been seen through that prism of energy security and freedom of navigation. And a big emphasis has been put by Western powers and by the US on securing the continuous flow through that waterway, but without necessarily paying much attention to what was happening around. And how the region as a geopolitical region was operating. And so a lot of the security buildup around the Gulf of Aden, for example, was about curbing piracy threats. And it was about also the US have tried to make sure to depoliticize the Red Sea as a waterway, to try to make sure that the waterway itself would not be geopolitically contested. But the problem of that approach and that focus on energy security and freedom of navigation is that, yes, piracy threats have been curbed, so there is less of a sense of urgency on that front, because also of the evolution of global energy markets. There might be a sense that energy security is not necessarily a top priority to the extent that it was in the past. We are in a period where the US is trying to shift a bit its involvement towards other theaters, towards the Asia Pacific, etc., and trying to decrease a bit its involvement in that part of the world. And the problem is that because a lot of the efforts in the Red Sea have been put on securing freedom of navigation, much less attention has been put on how the maritime security threats link to the continental ones, how the different countries and stakeholders that are bordering the Red Sea interact with each other, how that creates cycles of violence and instability. And the problem is that today we have a resurgence of these cycles of instability and of great power competition in that area that have not been addressed in a comprehensive manner until now. And we see it, for example, it's quite obvious when you look at how the different countries of the Red Sea fall between different administrative divisions or different departments or different US comments. There is quite little literature as well on the Red Sea as a geopolitical space that, you know, with the dynamics of its own. And so the problem is that the root causes of instability in that area, because of that focus on energy security, all these root causes of instability have not been addressed and understood properly. And that creates new maritime security threats that are re-emerging. So we have cycles of violence and conflicts and failed states around that region. We have a dozen of active conflicts, difficult political transitions as well, especially in the Horn. And that has potential spillover effects on freedom of navigation, as we saw with the Houthi attacks in the area. We see also growing interconnectedness between conflicts on both shores, with arms trafficking between Yemen, the Horn, with interconnections between some smuggling activities in the Red Sea and terrorism. And that feeds into a cycle of instability. We see also growing entanglement of political rivalries between both shores, with growing assertiveness of certain regional powers that are undertaking more independent foreign policies that project influence in their direct neighborhood. So we saw that with GCC countries, for example, projecting influence in the Horn of Africa. But we see also some African countries becoming more assertive in their foreign policies, especially Ethiopia and Egypt at the moment. Another point that is very important for the US is the resurgence also of potentially great power competition, with big external powers building a presence in the region. And we see, so there has been continuous interest of Russia, of course, but we see emerging Chinese presence. It is a region that is one of the most militarized in the world. And the naval presence in that region, also from Western powers, is shifting from trying to target piracy like it was 10 years ago, towards increasingly addressing these great power rivalry dynamics that are mounting in the region. And the problem for the US perspective on that is that there is growing uncertainties on the future of US involvement in that area. And this is problematic because we see a resurgence of these challenges, and it will make it difficult for the US to completely ignore that region in any case. And of course, like energy security and freedom of navigation remain crucial. But it's no longer necessarily like energy is no longer necessarily like the one driving element of Red Sea geopolitics. It's about projecting influence. It's about controlling strategic trade corridors or specific infrastructure like strategic ports or even internet cables. You have between 17 and 30% of world internet traffic that passes through the Red Sea. And China, for example, because we talk a lot about China, is definitely a player that the US is watching very closely in that area. But even China's interest in the Red Sea region is less and less about energy security. It was the one key driver for China's presence in the area like maybe 10 years ago. But now it's also about controlling access to key maritime trade routes and developing, access to developing markets and resources and gaining influence and support of these countries on international forums. So for the US, there is a need to acknowledge more how the Red Sea integrates itself into broader geoeconomic and geopolitical agendas and within broader security complexes. So a need to understand how these maritime security threats connect with continental security threats in the Red Sea region, how the Red Sea fits into the Middle East and Mediterranean security complex, and at large as well, how that fits into the broader Indo-Pacific complex and this kind of re-emerging East-West security axis. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks for an excellent presentation, Camille. This has really been a very enlightening conversation altogether, and I appreciate that everybody kept on time. So we ended up, with 1 hour. We now have a bit of time for conversation. I do have some questions from the audience that I'm going to put on the table, but I do, as I promised earlier when I talked to Tariq, raise this question about, the question actually Tariq and Besma brought it up in terms of what drives American policy and how it's likely to be affected. So one of the things that, we are of course assuming that American policy is calculating and rational most of the time, and it is part of the time overall. But those of you who may have followed the news in the past few days, when I hosted a forum on Friday, my colleague from Brookings, Bruce Riedel, who was at the White House when the horror of 9/11 occurred, he was with George W. Bush, the President of the United States, in the Oval Office 3 days later, 20 years today, September 14th, 2001, when Bush picked up the phone and called Tony Blair and told him, "We are going to attack Iraq." This happened 3 days before any consideration, any discussion, or any cause or effect, or anything to do, whether it had to do with 9/11 or to do with oil or to do with anything else. So, and to this day, I think it's a puzzle as to what was driving him. We could talk about that. But the point is, and we know that how disastrous that turned out, not just for the Middle East, of course, it has been disastrous, but for the United States. And so one of the questions that I want to put on the table for Tariq and Besma, particularly anybody else who wants to comment on it, is when you're calculating, were you warning, well, if the US withdraws from the Middle East, if the US should, then China and Russia are going to gain, or they're going to have a better relationship, economic relationship, and more coincidence of interest over oil with the Arab Gulf producer or Middle Eastern, including Iran, Middle Eastern oil, energy producers. Now, so what? I mean, I want to put that out on the table. I mean, what is it that the U.S. has to fear, particularly when you compare it to the cost that the U.S. has paid over the past couple of decades and more? Because I think I can make the argument, and many have made the argument, the U.S. is weaker globally today than it was 20 years ago because of its intervention. I mean, it's weaker vis-a-vis China, it's weaker vis-a-vis Russia. So what is it that the U.S. Is going to lose by that? And I'm not sure, I heard that. I'd love to hear more about it.
Besma, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, Shibli, you put a a very big question or a challenge for us on the table, and one that I'm inclined to agree with you on at one level. And I would say increasingly in the region, the sense of US withdrawal and US retreat is not necessarily seen as big a shock or as destabilizing a problem as it was, let's say, 10 years ago. Meaning there is a growing realization that the US is not what it used to be or what we thought it is. And for even regimes that had depended on the US, the unpredictability of policy at times, the mistakes of the last 20 years, and the many symptoms of withdrawal have driven home the realization that not only is the US withdrawing, that actually may not be a bad thing. And anyway, we could live with it. So I think we're moving in this direction, and maybe you're right. The US doesn't lose so much. In fact, the US has an opportunity to refocus on domestic priorities, unless, of course, the confrontation with China and Russia become the pivotal question. And that would then present tough choices for the US. How far do you go? Do you confront them only geopolitically on security affairs, or do you go into energy markets and economic areas as well? On the other hand, Shibli, and this is where I think, unfortunately, the way you have painted the pattern in which US policy and involvement is likely to evolve, this plays very well to China's and Russia's advantage. These are not countries that are interested in a unified Arab world or a coordinating Arab world or a cooperating Arab world. If anything, they are interested in bilateral relations. They have focused on that. They have perfected the game. China in particular is playing a very, very long game in the region. And a fragmented Arab world as we see today, and we're likely to see more of in the future, is going to further be convenient and workable from the perspective of China and Russia, as opposed to the US, where an alliance-based mindset, an unwillingness to put the resources in, and the fatigue you've painted is further discouraging of any renewed involvement. And quite frankly, Shibli, I don't think I'm alone. I don't think I'm sharing a secret. There's a growing sense in the region at large that the days of US commitment, presence, activism, energy are behind us. And we have to now think about a future of the Middle East and the Arab world where we need to live, exist, and accept US retreat and uncertainty vis-a-vis the US. And maybe that's not such a bad thing after all.
Yeah. And Basma, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, such thought-provoking questions. Thank you for that. So, what I find interesting, back to polls, which you'll appreciate, Shibli, is, when Pew Research did polls about sentiment about the Americans in the Middle East, if you recall, it was, what are the things that you dislike the most about the United States? And it was their foreign policy. But then if asked the question, well, what do you think about American values, American education, American culture? Loved it, right? So, in some way, I can't help but think if you had really a disinterested America in, day-to-day Middle East security affairs, you might actually find bilateral relations warming. Ironically, it might just be that way. The second part of that is, and I'm not happy about this part, but it might actually be good for the Americans on the economic side, because US arms sales are going to go through the roof. That's what we're seeing happening in the Gulf today. They're arming themselves, right? They're putting in missile defense systems to protect themselves against the Iranians because they don't expect the Americans to come rushing to their defense as they did 20 years ago. So I think that also it's, feeding into the military industrial complex, but that is, at the end of the day, it might just be a net benefit for the Americans in some way, just throwing that out there. On the question of China, I know there's a lot of, so many speculative papers, been hearing about this for so long about China's going to come and, replace the Americans in the Middle East. I've been reading papers like this for the past at least 15, 20 years. At the end of the day, China is far more strategic than the Americans have been on this. They look at the Middle East as a quagmire. They're not interested in replacing the Americans militarily. If you see Xi's speeches, it's consistent. It's consistent. The Americans, are wasting their time, their money. They're quite literally, he said something to the effect of their dilapidated, infrastructures, all because they spend their money on militarizing the Middle East. I mean, the Chinese are smarter in that way. They're not willing to invest, right? That kind of effort. So, they put a ship in the Persian Gulf here and there, but ultimately they don't have an interest in a military presence. They want deals. They want economic bilateral relationship. And they're getting that because they're energy hungry. This is obviously a population of almost 2 billion that have almost no real source of domestic fuel consumption or a fuel source. So they're extremely energy hungry. And they're never going to be a way to move completely away from oil in the short term because of the size of the population. So that's one thing. Russia, great question on Russia. It's far more interested in an Eastern European front. That to them is their backyard. I mean, you could look and say, well, what explains their involvement in Syria? Well, that was because of the Caucasus, right? They had 5,000 Chechnyan fighters leave, and the fear was always coming back home. Do they have like a huge military interest in the Middle East? Look, they're a spoiler. Their whole MO is about being, bringing in chaos wherever they go so they look better at home. And certainly they would absolutely continue playing disinformation and all the sort of usual ways of, causing trouble. That suits them very nicely. But to put real troops and hard assets, I think Syria is an anomaly. It was a port. Tartus was really one of the few accesses they had the only access, to the Mediterranean. It was one of the few ports outside of their own shoreline, let's say, that they wanted to keep. So it was really vital for them. And even there, they put really, really small amount of investment. I mean, people make a big deal out of it because it was such a game changer, only because the Americans and then the whole West didn't want to enter Syria because the Russians were already there. But truly, this is a declining power. They don't have a military in the same way they used to. So I don't really see anybody replacing the Americans in the Middle East in that way. I see actually them, Arab countries themselves, fortifying themselves more, arming themselves more, investing more in their military, which was what we're seeing actually happening, particularly in the Gulf countries. So again, I actually think that was such a provocative question. I never thought of it, but it's such a great question. And it just might, at the end of the day, be better for the Americans if they withdrew. And I don't think there's going to be this mad dash of competitors coming in because neither they have the capability or interest to really do the same thing the Americans have been offering most of the Arab countries. Thank you.
Thanks. So now I'm going to turn to a number of questions from the audience. I have one question, perhaps to Karen. Can you comment on China's relationship with Iran when it comes to oil and how that affects energy production and security in the region?
Right. Well, thanks. Yeah, there's a lot been said about this potential agreement between the Chinese and the Iranians for economic cooperation, for a lot of investment perhaps into Iran, but it's really not money on the table. This is more kind of in our perfect world what might happen. So it hasn't happened yet. But the Iranians are increasing their shipments of oil to China. They are evading sanctions in doing so. And the Chinese are, gladly taking what they can at a reduced price, right? So it sort of worked well for both sides. And this cement, again, this, as Besma described, these bilateral relationships where China doesn't really have to put a lot on the table, doesn't have to make any security guarantee, and really gets a discount product and, as their profit. I would just, if we could just go back to the previous conversation just a tad. I think these arguments about why the Middle East should matter to the United States and what are the consequences of a disengaged United States from the region. I think what's missing from that is an understanding of how we are reshaping the structure of the international economy with this disengagement. So yes, it may absolutely be true that our bilateral ties and the perception of America may improve in the Middle East. It also absolutely may be true that we see an increase in arms sales and an arms race, particularly a nuclear arms race, I think is happening next, as it's pretty much a given now that Iran will come to a bomb. But the bad thing, in my view, is that we are going to see the highest growing, highest populations parts of our world, the most energy hungry, reshaping their institutions and their economies in ways which are in line with authoritarian capitalism, right? They're going to model their economies in different ways where it's going to be at the disadvantage of the United States and US citizens and institutions and our firms and our banks to be able to operate in that space. We sacrifice something ourselves in that. So I think that's the argument that you have to make of why the United States needs to maintain, in some ways also a security posture in the region, to defend that system. Now, it's not a very popular view anymore, but I feel like it has to be on the table. It's part of the argument. There was another question about, why isn't US oil production part of the conversation and, kind of the OPEC plus environment? Why don't we coordinate more on global supply? We're not running out of it, right? We have plenty, but we're in this transition moment where there are a lot of disruptions and sort of misunderstandings of, where the oil is and how to get it to who needs it. And so I think this collaboration with Russia, in particular with the Gulf states, is on a bit of thin ice. And I don't know how long that will persist. I also don't know what this means for, US domestic production. We have a lot of kind of legal gray area for, how our shale industry will continue and rebound. But for the Russians right now, they're not even able to meet their quotas under the OPEC plus agreement. They're not able to produce what they're allowed to produce, right? So, they've been at a bit of a, they've had advantages that other producers haven't had, sort of a cushy quota, which, they're not really getting there. So that has to do with where the CapEx situation is globally, and really in terms of, what Russia's capacity is.
Those are really important points. And I don't think I didn't hear anyone, including Besma, say that the US is actually going to fully withdraw from the Middle East, because that's not likely, as everybody has pointed out. It's a question of how you set your priorities, what's important, how you don't repeat the previous mistake of overwhelming intervention in a way that's detrimental to your interests. But obviously we are at a juncture where these interests have to be reassessed for sure. The next question is for Camille, I think would directly ask to Camille, which is, how do you see the competition amongst the Gulf states shaping the geopolitics of the Red Sea?
Sure. This one has been quite an interesting topic for the past few years. So we've seen definitely lots of cases of Gulf countries projecting some of their rivalries on other theaters, and the Horn is one of them. Somalia, Sudan have been some of the key focus points. And but the one question recently was to what extent, with the patching up a bit of this relationship intra-GCC, to what extent that would also ease a bit the competition in the Horn. And it seems that for now, it's still continuing to kind of the same level that it was before, with CC, for example, the Qataris trying to regain a bit of influence, especially in Sudan, where they have reopened their relations earlier this year. In Somalia, also trying to play a bigger role in the election issues that we had also earlier this year. So this is still ongoing. But the real question is, and I think that's the question that was asked, is to what extent do they really shape what is happening in the Horn? And the thing is that when you see the amount of money that has been poured from the Gulf into the Horn, with trying to shape these dynamics, trying to gain some friendly regimes or gain some specific concessions, at the end of the day, it looks like this attempt has been a little bit of a, maybe not a failure, but has not been as successful maybe as what was attempted to. And we see that at the end of the day, Horn countries still have a lot of agency, and they have been playing off different external players also to their own interests. And so sometimes we need to move beyond a little bit this representation of these passive African states that are being manipulated by external powers. And when you look, for example, even some of the achievements that have been made by Gulf states, like this very mediatized Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement, for example, that was orchestrated by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. When you talk to the Horn side, they tell you that they didn't have really much of a role anyway. They hosted it. They gave a bit of money in exchange of that kind of arrangement. But at the end of the day, the real politics happened on the Horn side. And today, when the Europeans or the US are trying to engage Gulf countries on trying to solve issues like the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, they realize that they can try to provide some investment packages as an incentive, but they don't have the power to really shape and push these countries to take decisions if these countries are not ready to take these decisions. So that's the big problem, is to what extent this Gulf influence is really shaping politics in the Horn or not.
If anyone wants to add to this, feel free, but I want to ask the next question from Imad Harb to Besma, Momani, or anybody else, but it's really regarding the comment that Besma made. We're not going back to the same old mode, particularly this remote kind of a mode of work, which I witness and everybody is witnessing, and some industries are feeling, and they know they're not going back to where it was before. Has anybody done any kind of calculation on the energy consumption impact of a profound change in the mode of work that we have? Obviously, many of us probably on this panel flew all the way to Europe to just a 1 hour lecture and turn around and come all the way back from Europe. And so I wonder, obviously what, the implications that could be considerable, but is there any study of this at this point?
Not that I'm aware of, to be honest with you. I think there's just so many things in flux. I'm not sure if Karen might have some, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Karen, too, but some of the estimates of how much of, the figure I would think about too is think about sort of how much consumption of oil and fuel is individual. Think of the fact that, of a 7-day week, we probably drive the most on, 5 work days. And I think you can at least divide that by half. I mean, many of us are talking about a hybrid model, with some of the tech industry talking about completely getting rid of commuting. So I don't know. I mean, Karen, if you know that one little number or have anything to add from an industry perspective, I'd be fascinated to hear too.
I would just say, a lot of our global oil demand, about 10% of it is in transport, right? And so airlines are already being very vocal about their concerns for recovery, particularly into early 2022. And the expectation is that business travel is falling off and will not rebound, right? So if we're at 100 million barrels a day, that's, chopping off a good part of that 10 million, right at the top. So yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, and commuting goes into that as well.
One question here that perhaps can go to Tarek on the role of Russia, the Russia's relationship with OPEC, really, about sort of the possible cooperation and conflict, when it comes to energy output, and any thoughts that you may add on that kind of relationship and where it's headed?
Thank you, Shibli. I think maybe Karen can do a better job answering that question. From my own vantage point, I have been a bit surprised at how well that relationship has worked so far, especially once the Russians and the Saudis have managed to find a working relationship to help manage the OPEC plus group. I think, as had been mentioned earlier, this relationship extends now beyond the state-to-state relationship. It's also a relationship between the respective national oil companies who not only work well together, understand one another, but increasingly are also cooperating through investment deals. This is not just Saudi Arabia and the Russians, or the Emiratis and the Russians. This is also Qatar and the Russians. The Russians, it seems to me, this is one area where their soft/economic leverage and diplomacy has allowed them to be seen and to become a critical player in maintaining stability within OPEC. How long this will go, I think it's going to be subject to some of the uncertainties that have been discussed earlier about the energy transition, the rise of gas, and what I think Karen was pointing out to earlier, which is that gas is going to be where geopolitical competition is likely to take place over the next decade or two as a transition between crude and renewables. That is certainly the view amongst many observers, and that actually creates a lot of potential complications, but also opportunities for Russia to become not only an important player on the production and marketing and sharing side, but also on the pipelines. You know, one country we haven't talked about today, I don't think anyone has mentioned them since the morning, is Turkey. Turkey has interests in the Mediterranean. It has interests with Russia. It has interests in Europe. It's potentially a supplier, but also a transit for a lot of the important pipelines that bring Russian gas. So a lot to put in the mix with geopolitical implications and complexity that, quite frankly, are going to require a Herculean effort, but also a very tactful management by any U.S. energy diplomacy in the future.
Great. Karen, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, one of the things that we're seeing among national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds is that they're willing to be in each other's businesses, right? And so these are, you know, very, very competitive sectors, whether it's oil or gas or renewables. But you see a lot of hedging, and that's why Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, their sovereign wealth funds have partnerships with the Russian sovereign wealth fund, and they invest in each other's energy businesses. You know, you'll see Gulf companies investing in the Arctic projects in Russia. But it's also true that Tarek says, you know, the next sort of wave or, you know, big market to that will impact our geopolitics is a gas market. And so this is why Nord Stream 2 is so important, and Russia's ability to supply Europe. And this is why also you see players in the Middle East getting into that East Med business, including the Gulf states. So I did mention in my remarks the Emirati investment, the Mubadala investment in the Tamar field owned by Israel. That's one great example of this kind of hedging strategy of being in all energy product lines, right? So that's why these relationships, particularly the Gulf Russia relationship, they're quite tenuous. They, you know, they use each other, but ultimately they are competitors.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all four of you for a really exceptional set of presentations and conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it and learned from it, and I'm sure everybody else. Thank you all, those who joined us, for joining us. My apologies to anyone whose questions we did not get to in time. I also should say that day 2 of this conference is tomorrow, and you're free to join tomorrow morning. You can register at arabcenterdc.org. This was great. Thank you all, and hope to see you tomorrow.